Election fraud. You may think you've heard enough about it in the last couple of weeks, but we're here to tell you that you haven't. Welcome to another TLDR US video, which is the latest in many videos we've released since the election to look at the allegations of voter fraud. This time around, we're going to be investigating the use, or more accurately as you'll see shortly, misuse, of a mathematical phenomenon called Benford's Law that sprung up on social media in the last week. Now, we're no experts in maths, so this has taken a fair bit of digging and reliance on the investigations of some very clever people. So after all of that research and bugging of maths grads, what did we find out? Well, let me quickly say first, thanks to everyone who's been subscribing lately. Our videos have reached a ton of new people lately, hence this terrible subscribed versus unsubscribed ratio we've been showing you. But recently, more of you have been subscribing. However, with 75% of you still not subscribed, you can still do us a favour. Hit subscribe and get yourself some more TLDR news. Thanks for your support. Let's start with the obvious. We should probably explain what Benford's Law actually is. Well, the law itself is actually pretty interesting. It states that in a naturally occurring set of numerical data, the leading digit, or first digit, is more frequently a lower number. Basically, you'll see numbers starting with 1 more than any other digit. The digit 1 is the leading digit about 30% of the time, it's 2 about 17.6% of the time, and so on and so forth, on a logarithmic trend. The law has to cover orders of magnitude, in other words powers of 10, for it to be most effective, and there are a few other things you have to remember when applying Benford's Law. First, as with many things, larger sample sizes work better. Secondly, it needs the principle of equal opportunity. Basically, in a set of data, all numbers from 1 to 5 need to be equally able to be the leading digit. And finally, you have to keep in mind that Benford's Law does not and cannot confirm or reject whatever you're applying to. It's not foolproof. Researchers at the University of Washington have historically tried to advise caution over concluding that Benford's Law proves fraud, particularly because sometimes its basic assumptions aren't met. While the principle of equal opportunity is met by the reporting of vote counts, the assumption that numbers must span multiple orders of magnitude is not met in some states. And considering that much of the analysis on the web in the last week or so is looking at even more micro level, merely individual cities and counties, it's just not valid. The law is more commonly used in accounting to flag up potential fraud and cooking of the books. But Theodore Hill and other experts are at pains to emphasise the use to flag up fraud, not prove fraud. There are plenty of other reasons why someone's tax return, for example, might not follow Benford's Law. If it was applied and it looked like there was something fishy going on, this would point investigators down the path of further investigation through audit. It would not be sufficient to prosecute a person on a loan. The same goes for elections. Benford's Law could point someone in the direction of potential voter fraud, but there would still need to be much more research into the micro-level data. In support of this, as found in a 2011 study, Benford's Law as a way of identifying election fraud is essentially equivalent to the toss of a coin. Basically, we should be really careful when using it to proclaim that fraud has been committed. Sure, use it if you want, but only on a large scale, and certainly don't be convinced that it's proof of anything, because, to be honest, it's not. That being said, there are a few cases, for example the Iranian election in 2019, where scholars have used Benford's Law to point to potential fraud, and the existence of such fraud was found through further investigation. But this doesn't mean that the law was proof of the fraud. The investigation was still needed to validate it. And this brings us onto the accusations flying around on the web in the last week or so. Before we go into this, we just want to clarify that while there has been plenty of misinformation going around, these cases don't necessarily fall into that category. Sure, there's the possibility that people are sharing these theories in an attempt to delegitimize the election, but we also feel that the analysis of the data by some armchair mathematicians was produced in good faith. But many of them simply didn't understand the conditions needed for Benford's Law to work, as well as its many caveats, so in the end they used it incorrectly. We're going to provide links to our sources for various reasons, but one of these is not so our viewers can go and harass and abuse people. So please don't go on and attack these people online for what may well be misleading. Shortly after the election, one of our team members shared a tweet with the whole team, which claimed that using research posted on GitHub, Biden's vote tallies apparently violate Benford's law. At first glance, and without proper investigation, you might think, wow, this really does look like something fishy is going on here. But then when you look into the data provided, it's problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, the research only analyses big cities and city counties, such as Chicago, Milwaukee, and others, where Biden naturally would do better than Trump. So immediately there's skepticism that these locations have been cherry-picked to prove a point. Secondly, Matt from YouTube Stand Up Maths analysed the data used by this person for the Chicago results. He found that in the city of Chicago, like in many cities, precincts are relatively small, and 98.7% of the precincts in the city reported vote totals of between 100 and 999, with the average being 516. There's a clear lack of order of magnitude here, as we're only looking at 3-digit totals. Additionally, as the Biden-Harris ticket was getting a large proportion of these city votes, the leading digit of these counts is clearly less likely to be in the 1s and 2s, and more likely to be in the 3s, 4s, and 5s. The same is the case when looking at the analysis of Milwaukee's election data given by the same source. One expert in Benford's law and elections states that this analysis does not cover enough orders of magnitude to be valid. Although a very simplified explanation, he illustrates the problems with the data as well, and it's pretty much the same thing that Matt points out in Chicago. He found that the average number of votes reported in Milwaukee precincts was 800, and Joe Biden got roughly 70% in the city, making the average number of votes given to Biden in the Milwaukee area about 560. So it doesn't take a genius to work out from here that the more commonly occurring leading digits in this case would not be 1s and 2s, but those in the range of 4s, 5s, and 6s. Dr. Jen Goldbeck, a college professor and expert in Benford's law, got into a fiery Twitter exchange with a Trump supporter on Twitter, in response to a graphic shared that depicts Trump's votes in Michigan following Benford's law, Biden's failing to. While it's probably an exaggeration from Goldbeck to claim that Benford's law is not even useful for detecting election fraud, we have already discussed how it's not proof, but can work as an alarm bell. And she does also fairly point that the graph is not labelled. Anyone who's gone to school can tell you that you should always label your axes, and you immediately lose credibility if you don't. I don't know about anyone else, but that always got me into trouble. Anyway, I digress. Goldbeck also points out that Benford's law only works on very specific types of numbers. It's not fully clear what she means here, but presumably she's referencing the need for orders of magnitude, thus looking at national data as opposed to precinct level data. But wait, we're not done quite yet. There are more amateur statisticians out there. An Epoch Times article summarised a few people's findings, and again, their arguments don't really work. Firstly, in one case, there's a general misunderstanding of the fact that most people are familiar with by now, that in many states, mail-in ballots that were counted later on or after Election Day skewed heavily towards the Democrats. But if you forget that and take all the accusations of this tweeter at face value, they're arguing that the late counts in Milwaukee were violating Benford's law. Well, of course they were, but not in any sinister way. As we've already found out about Milwaukee, it skews heavily towards Biden, and even more so in the later counts, where mail-in ballots are more prevalent. As the average precinct size is around 800, of course when a candidate's getting a high proportion of votes, as Biden was, these leading digits will be in the 4, 5, 6 range, and many even higher. In early reporting, presumably votes cast in person, the source shows a much greater proportion of 1s and 2s. Now, we're no experts, but if you think logically about this, if turnout was lower on the day, which it was, with just over 78,000 in-person votes compared to the 170,000 absentee ballots, then naturally, the vote count reports that come before absentee ballots are included are going to have lower leading digits. There's also the argument to be made that because the sample size is so small, you can't come to any sort of conclusion about this kind of data. Because of the overload of poor uses of Benford's law and many requests for an explanation, Walter Mebane, a leading expert, felt compelled to write a response. He argues, as we've alluded to, that it's widely understood that the first digits in precinct counts are not good for trying to diagnose election fraud, because the leading digit is largely determined by the number of voters in each precinct, and usually the share of votes received by parties or candidates does not vary all that greatly across precincts. Looking at Chicago again, he notes that Biden got 82% of the votes, and when looking at a graph on the total number of votes cast, the shape is pretty much the same, just slightly shifted to the left, due to him not receiving all the votes. Because Biden is getting the majority of votes cast, the leading digits are not going to be in the 1s and 2s, but higher. Just for clarity, Mebane does note some potential concern over some harder to explain Biden-Harris results, before stating that similar concerns have proved to be not problematic in other elections. Just to refute allegations further, the right-leaning Washington Examiner has made the point that some statisticians question Benford's law's applicability, particularly in an election where ballot counters are organising ballots in a manner that differs from precinct to precinct. Beyond the fact that it's not very accurate for elections in general, this argues that it's even less accurate in this election. Before we go, we wanted to remind everyone that we're not trying to be biased here, and we're genuinely interested in finding out whether election fraud has been committed. If you have any legitimate evidence, or you'd like us to investigate something specific, contact us by emailing voterfraud@tldrnews.co.uk. But at the moment, there's very little, if any, concrete evidence, and in the case of the use of Benford's law, while our refutation does not mean that voter fraud cannot have occurred, just that we want to be clear that this tool cannot legitimately be used as evidence, especially in the small-scale way that some have been implementing it. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when we release further videos. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.